Well, hello xenographers everywhere, and welcome to another episode. We've talked a lot on this channel about vintage lenses from the film days, and if you're a regular viewer you'll know I use them all the time on mirrorless cameras. I love them for their signature look and the way they put their own individual stamp on an image, and also for the sheer pleasure of using old and new technologies together. But how do they measure up to modern lenses? Can they walk the walk? Can they cut it? Or are they all mouth and no trousers? In this episode, we're going to find out. So the modern lens I'm using is a kit lens. It's the 28-70 f3.5 to f5.6 that came with my Sony A7. It's not the most expensive or glamorous of lenses, and it's certainly not the fastest, but it makes some nice images, and it illustrates the general nature of modern lenses pretty well. And the vintage lenses are the Zuiko 50mm 1.4. This can fairly be termed a bokeh beast. It's got as much of the blurry stuff as anyone could ever need, and then some. It's great in low light, but it can be a little tricky to nail focus shooting wide open. We've got the Helios 44-2, one of my favourite lenses bar none, on account of the wild and swirly bokeh it makes. It's a 58mm f2 lens with a close focus distance of 50 centimetres. It's an exact copy of the 1930s Zeiss Biotar, and it's cheap. Prices go from about £30 to £60. Next we've got the Leica Summitar, a lovely old lens with a 50mm focal length, maximum aperture f2. Colours are on the warm side, it's very sharp, and it makes some wonderful blurry background. It'll give you plenty of swirl, though not quite as much as the Helios, and the way it renders point light sources is nothing short of magical. Finally, we've got the Industar 61, one of the cheapest lenses in the world. It's a 50mm f2.8 lens. It gives some very nice results, it's very sharp, and it's really small and light too. So, of the four vintage lenses, it seems that those that give the best results in sharpness are the Helios and the Leica. The Leica's well known for being a sharp lens, so that's not too surprising. The surprise result here is the Helios. This is often said to be a fairly soft lens, but in this case that doesn't seem to be true, and you can see some very fine detail in this shot. The Industar doesn't seem to do that well at all in this test. That again is a surprise because it's well known as a fairly sharp lens, but it doesn't seem to have resolved fine detail in quite as clear a way as the Helios or the Leica have. It is, however, sharper at the edges. Another surprise is that the 50mm Zuiko 1.4 doesn't seem quite equal to either the Helios or the Leica. In this shot at least, it's just not as sharp. And in this shot you can really see very clearly the shift towards cool colours that the Zuiko lens displays. The modern Sony lens gives good sharpness right across the frame. All the features are very clearly defined, and in this shot it definitely has the edge over the vintage lenses. Contrast is generally stronger too, so a clear win for the Sony lens in the sharpness category. Now let's have a look at what kind of background blur these lenses make. Well, here it's a very different story. All of the vintage lenses make much nicer blur than the Sony lens. Perhaps that's not surprising because the Sony lens is a lot slower than the others. So right from the start, it's not going to give you the same amount of blur, but the quality of that blur is important too. All of the vintage lenses make some very beautiful background blur. This is the Helios version, and it's filled with beautiful bubbles in the background. It's pretty sharp on the leaf there where it's in focus, and we've got this lovely softness to the out of focus areas. The Industar at f2.8 is the slowest of the vintage lenses, but even that lens makes some very, very pleasing, very, very soft background blur. Really lovely. The blur from the Leica is nothing short of magical. It's very beautiful indeed. We've got these little ellipses around the periphery of the image. The way it renders point light sources is absolutely fantastic. And on balance, I'd say it's probably got the nicest blur of the lenses in this group. Blur from the Zuiko 50 is very nice indeed. It's very, very soft, and it renders point light sources with an almost circular shape. Although personally, I don't find it as nice as the blur from the Leica lens. The Sony lens produces blur that is somewhat underwhelming. And I'm really talking here in terms of the quality of the blur. It's just not as pleasing as what you get from the older lenses. The older lenses are dreamy. The older lenses are beautiful. The blur from the Sony lens is of a different character altogether. It doesn't give you the sort of dreamy, beautiful image that the vintage lenses do. So a clear win here for old school lenses. Looking at colour rendition, it's clear all the lenses do a reasonably good job of rendering these colours, but none have quite the contrast of the modern Sony lens. And so the colours seem slightly flatter, they're not quite as punchy. Here's the Helios version of the shot, and it's rendered the colours very nicely. It's got a reasonable contrast, and it makes a nice image. It also makes some very nice soft background blur. It's plenty sharp enough, and overall it does make a very nice image indeed. In this image taken by the Industar, we seem to have hit upon the sweet spot of the lens. This image has good contrast, it has very nice colour, and the background blur is of a very nice quality too. It's clearly not as blurry as the Helios, but the blur has a nice soft quality. This is a very nice image to look at, and I think the little Industar does very well here. The image from the Leica lens is fairly similar to that from the Industar lens, except it's rather sharper. That's not a surprise because this Leica lens is well known for being very sharp. The colours are nicely rendered, the contrast is good and strong. But if we look at the background blur, especially to the left of the frame, we can see that we've actually got some rather busy bokeh going on. And I think that distracts from the image a little bit. I think the blur from the Industar was definitely a little bit nicer in this shot. Here's the same image shot by the Olympus lens. It's very sharp, the colours are good, if a little cool, it's got good contrast, and the background blur is very soft, very nice indeed. It's actually quite similar to the blur made by the Helios, so it seems that that extra stop hasn't really made very much difference between these two. The clear winner here though, at least from a technical perspective, has to be the Sony. Contrast is quite a bit stronger than any of the vintage lenses, sharpness is better, and colours are very strong and very punchy. Very nice indeed. Of course, because this lens is a lot slower than the others, the blur in the background is less pronounced. Not only that, but the blur doesn't have the character that the vintage lenses can give. I find it rather nondescript, a little bit bland, a little bit generic if you like, with no real character or quirkiness. It's just some blur. Nevertheless, all things considered, I think the Sony lens takes the prize for this shot. These shots of the sky show us how well or otherwise the lenses cope with vignetting, and the results aren't too surprising. This shot from the Helios shows some quite considerable darkening in the corners. The Industar does rather better, and although it does show some vignetting, it doesn't seem particularly bad. The Leica lens does show some quite considerable darkening in the corners, even more so than the Helios, which is quite a surprise. I've never noticed that trait on this lens before, but nevertheless it's very clearly there. Worst offender of all though in this category is the poor old Olympus 50mm 1.4. Perhaps because of that wide aperture, we've seen some very considerable darkening in the corners, and the corners on this shot, especially at the top, actually look very dark indeed, almost black. In this test, the Olympus trails in last place. Here's an example of vignetting from the Sony lens, and as you can see, there's almost none at all. I would say that this lens is the clear winner here, except I think the Industar matches it. So joint first place in the vignetting stakes for the Industar and the Sony. So it seems that the vintage lenses and the modern lens I've tested here have strengths and weaknesses in different areas. The modern lens produces punchier colours, more contrast, less vignetting, and more sharpness as a rule. The older lenses produce entirely acceptable sharpness and much nicer background blur. The Sony lens has what you might call a generic look. It doesn't have much character, whereas the vintage lenses all have a signature look which can work in the appropriate context. And at the end of the day, what's important is not technical details, but the feel of an image. In the real world, we don't usually compare lenses as we're shooting them. We just enjoy each lens for its specific strengths. There are situations where vintage lenses will fit the bill, and there are also situations where a more modern lens is needed. So, that's it from me for now. I hope this episode has been enjoyable. I hope it's been of some use. Please do like and subscribe. The more people who like and subscribe, the easier it is for me to keep making these videos. Thanks to everyone who's subscribed so far. As ever, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography. Bye bye for now.